committee. I'm very pleased to see so many colleagues here who were there at that last meeting, but I think it's also incredibly encouraging to see new faces in the audience and faces who have come into the profession and are already making a contribution to it since that symposium in this field. I'm conscious that we have three very interesting talks this morning, and I don't really want to take up too much time and really concentrate on the presentations. I'll try and be as fierce as I can to keep everybody to time, but as I know all the speakers quite well, it might be quite difficult to achieve this. But I think we'll run the first two talks concurrently, one after another, and then keep questions to the session at the end of the morning. So it'll give everybody some time to think about the presentations and perhaps ask more focused questions at the end. Our first session today is concerned with the actual presentation of particular treatments, two particular treatments at the beginning, and then the third talk is a more general talk about treatments, the OPD. And as the first two talks both were funded, George's project by the current Getty initiative, which you heard about just recently, and the second project was funded in a very interesting way, which I think Britta will say something about in her presentation. Well, without more ado, I'd like to introduce George to the platform to talk about the treatment of the Durer's Adam and Eve at the Prado. His co-author of the talk, Jose de la Fuente Martinez, is also produced a paper. George will be giving the talk, but I thought I should say a little bit about Jose's career. George was telling me, in fact, that he trained as a very skilled woodworker and also has a degree in art history, and then worked as a teacher in the conservation school in Madrid, and then was taken into the Prado to work as a woodworker. And there George noticed that he had particular talents, and out of this combined project, I think a very wonderful treatment has evolved. So without more ado, George, would you like to?
Good morning. Welcome. Great, thanks, Sean. So, this morning I'd like to present to you the recent structural treatment of Durer's Adam and Eve panels. In fact, we only completed them some 2 short weeks ago. And this is the latest example of collaboration between the Metropolitan Museum and the Prado, and specifically between Jose de la Fuente and me, which stretches back nearly 20 years. Here we are in 1990 when we worked on the great Van der Weyden descent from the cross, and here we see it in various stages of disassembly. And here's the Rubens Three Graces, which we completed in 1997. The conservation of the Durer panels represents the first major project of the Getty Panel Initiative, about which we'll be, of course, hearing much more later in the program. From the left, we have Alan Miller, who recently joined the staff of the Metropolitan after having graduated from the Courtauld, and I have to thank him profusely for helping me put together all the images in this presentation, particularly the graphics images. And then we have Ton Wilmering, the Getty Foundation grants officer, who stopped by for a few days to make sure we weren't wasting all the money in the flamenco tablaos. And then Enrique Quintana, the head of the Paintings Conservation Department at the Prado, and of course Jose de la Fuente. The project really ideally suits the Panel Painting Initiative by addressing many of its key areas of focus. It fosters collaborative efforts between major institutions, the Met and the Prado in this case. It conserves a significant work of art, the Durer. It promotes exchange between recognized experts, presumably Jose and myself. It provides intensive training for more junior specialists. Here we have Alan and Sue-Ann Chewy from the Getty, who came by twice during the treatment to work with us for some days. and it provides assistance to the staff of other major collections in the care of panel paintings. And here in this wonderful slide taken by Sue Ann, we see Dora Sally from the National Museum in Budapest, and Bela Nagy, who is the person who actually executes the panel treatments in Budapest. So the panels were painted by Durer in 1507, shortly after the return from his second trip to Italy. The subject occupied him from 1504, when he begins to experiment with the composition. The drawing on the left from the Morgan Library shows the figure of Eve on the left, and the famous engraving from the Albertina on the right was widely disseminated. Already in 1504, he's thinking about the figures as two separate pendant works. In these two drawings from the Albertina, he uses the recto and verso of the same sheets to reverse the poses, and the geometric proportional system used to position the figures demonstrates a familiarity with Leon Battista Alberti's Della Pittura and Piero della Francesca's De Prospettiva Pingendi. His study of the subject culminates in the Prado panels. The Adam may even reflect direct knowledge of the Apollo Belvedere, excavated in 1489, and although correlations have been made between the Eve and the Medici Venus, that sculpture may not yet have been unearthed by the time of Durer's travels. In any event, these panels were extremely influential in the diffusion of Italian Renaissance ideas to the north. A brief chronology dates the panels to 1507, although it's not clear whether they were commissioned by the city of Nuremberg or simply given by Durer to the city. In the late 16th century, they were given to Rudolf II and taken to Prague Castle, where they remained until 1648, when they were captured by the Swedes. Christina of Sweden, though, never really cared much for German painting and thought it more expedient to give them as a gift to Philip IV of Spain in 1655. The panels survived the fire at the Alcázar in Madrid in 1734, and were again threatened by fire when Carlos III decided to have them burned in 1762 because of their indecent nudity. Fortunately, the court painter Anton Raphael Mengs persuaded the Marquis against the move, claiming that he could use them for teaching anatomy to his students at the Accademia di San Fernando, where they were eventually moved in 1792. In 1827, they were finally transferred to the Prado. However, they were relegated for another decade to the Sala Reservada, where nudes were quarantined for fear of corrupting the public morality. In 1838, they were integrated finally into the permanent collection by School and Chronology. Between 1936 and 1938, during the Spanish Civil War, 22 shipments of 391 Prado paintings were sent to the medieval fortified Torres Serrano outside Valencia to keep them out of harm's way. And then in February 1939, the entire group was sent to Geneva, where they were exhibited publicly. On September 5, 1939, 4 days after the outbreak of World War II, they were again packed on a train and shipped back to Madrid and into the Prado. And these photos were taken in January 1938 during the packing for transit to Valencia. And they're important to us because they show the Eve panel now face down, and we can see exactly what the reverse looked like, and then the packing of the Adam. But instead, the state of the panels now, the Eve was in almost identical condition to the photo that we see in the 1938 photograph. But in the meantime, the Adam had been thinned and heavily cradled. So because of this discrepancy in the state of the panels, they had very, very different surfaces. The difficulty was in two radically different treatments using the same conservation principles to arrive at some sort of aesthetic solution that would balance both pictures. So in this, we logically decided to work on the Eve first, since it was in better condition, and the panel itself consists of 3 pine boards, just simply butt joined, not very good quality wood, tangential cut boards, and From the reverse, we can also see that there is stopa over over various areas of the surface. On the reverse in 4 bands, the 2 in the middle, of course, to avoid the crosspiece, and they correspond with other stopa under the preparation on the painted side. But curiously enough, there's another set of 3 bands vertically in the upper portion, which have no corresponding stopa on the front or on the bottom or on the atom panel. And while I can understand the symmetrical arrangement of the bands on front and back to stabilize the panel from warping, I can't really understand why this other group was added. They seem to be done in 2 different moments as well. The horizontal bands are much finer, and the vertical ones being a little bit rougher. However, they're all original. They're all under the same original coating, and in fact, that coating is a kind of stylized imitation of stone or porphyry, and you can see the red and white flecks painted on that surface. The earliest split is exactly that, a split and not a disjoin, and it was first repaired, we think, based on documentary evidence in 1853, when 7 butterflies were added along that, and then also the 3 cross members were put on it, and a canvas strip added in the back. Subsequently, another crack formed adjacent, and that was then also covered with canvas strip, which went right over all of the cross pieces. So we wanted to release the panel from the stress of the modern cross pieces, which were really rigidly holding it flat. But we had to be very careful because, as you can see in this area that corresponds to the original cross piece, the pressure on that cross piece has started to cause splits at the bottom of the crosspiece track at the acute angles, and it's actually pulling up the paint surface on the front because of the extensive worm tunneling. So we decided to face that area, turn the panel over, and remove the original crosspiece first, while it was still being held in place firmly by the modern crosspiece. So we just made some incisions and then pushed it out with a clamp. I'm sure everyone is aware by now that you should never tap out cross pieces with a mallet or something like that, or cross pieces from a cradle, that it's much better to use the clamping force slightly diagonal so that the whole panel is in compression and there's no danger of inadvertently opening a split by trying to tap it out. So we just, applying pressure there, are able to remove it. Once that was out, you can see in the modern crosspiece here, there's no visible means of attachment of that crosspiece to the panel. And as amazing as it might seem, they had decided in 1853 that the best way to attach them would be to screw them on through the front. So the heads of the screws are under the front of the panel. But curiously enough, you can see that there was some consideration to placing the screws where it would cause the least aesthetic damage. You can see the figure. There are four at the top and the bottom. There are 5 in the middle to clearly avoid the figure of Eve, and then the strategically placed central one as strategically placed as the leaf. And so anyhow, we had to then clean the surface in those areas, and then remove the fillings. And here you can see, because the screw in the middle of the panel was relatively parallel to the paint surface, it could simply be unscrewed. But the ones on the outer extremities, the heads were pulled underneath the paint surface, and so we realized that was because of cumulative shrinkage in the panel, which the crosspiece wouldn't move, and it would pull the heads slightly under the surface, so we couldn't extract them from the front so easily. So we made some incisions, simple incisions, lifted them out and isolated the screws within these small blocks. You here it is in the process. We left the bottom crosspiece for last because that's where the largest open split was, so we figured it had already discharged a lot of the stress in that area, so it would be less disruptive for the panel to be in this temporary state while we advanced. So it's immediately after removing the cross pieces, you can see that the panel acquired immediately a fairly significant warp. We then turned the panel over, and we could, by simply holding the screw in place, we could unscrew the small blocks of wood, and then that would give us enough play to be able to extract the screws from the front. Then we turned it over, supported it with some wedges on the sides, and then proceeded to remove the canvas with Laponite RD, synthetic inorganic collagen, and we covered it with mylar, and it took about an hour to swell, and then we were able to remove that without causing any damage to the coating, to the original black coating. Here we are removing various parts of that. After that, we cleaned the entire surface of the back of any glue residue and also just the entire surface with synthetic saliva, which is an enzymatic solution, mostly with also citric acid and cleared with distilled water. Here you can see the sort of porphyry pattern coming out during that treatment. Now, in the eave, we wanted to respect, of course, the original surface, and so wherever possible, we simply re-glued all the splits with simple re-gluing and clamping. But in some cases, for instance, here we're using a codfish glue, but it didn't close up completely. When we had the surface totally in line, there was still a gap at one end, and we used an Araldite 1253 Ciba-Geigy resin as a gap filler there, and then just simply with clamps did as much as we could. So here we are with some other areas clamped up in the meantime. But after completing all the cracks that we could by simple re-gluing, there still was the major crack left of center on the bottom, and that presented a much bigger problem because, as you can see in this rather bad image on the right, the amount of woodworm infestation was so extensive along that crack that it virtually had no structural integrity, and it simply broke apart. And we felt that it was not sufficient to simply re-glue the panel in that area, especially because on the surface it bowed inward so much, and we wanted to push that out to get a more uniform curvature across the front, and we felt that would not be a sufficient hold. So we decided to route with a high-speed router to route a track along there. Now, I will speak a lot about that, but not right now, because that will be largely taken care of in the treatment of the atom. But let me just show you the treatment as we executed it here. And this gave us an opportunity to vacuum out a large quantity of frass from the woodworm cavities, and then we clamped up a system to adjust the surface curvature. And many people might be under the impression that by doing something like that, you're somehow forcing the panel into some sort of curvature that it doesn't want to be in, and that's not really the case. If you think about it, really, that by exerting pressure downward in that area, the two arcs of those curves are fairly rigid things, so that by simply pushing down there, what happens is the extremities move upwards, so that all we're doing is really moving it in a different sort of alignment. And while it does introduce a small amount of torque, what it does is it also relieves the stress at where the crack split ends. So we felt that was perfectly justified. And here we have the wedges being set up to be put in, and we then used again a Ciba-Geigy Araldite to push as deeply as we could into the worm tunnels to create a network that would bond well onto the small wedges, and then inserted those. And here's Jose planing that down. And you could see that when it was finished, we achieved a bond that was 17 millimeters deep, the entire thickness of the panel, and it still only read 3.5 millimeters on the reverse surface. 3.5 millimeters is fairly narrow. And so here there was just one area where there was an open split adjacent, and it went right through one of the butterflies, so we decided to replace just that one single one, and we rebuilt that in the grain direction. So this gives you an opportunity to make a much more precise fit of the wedges to the bottom of the crosspiece track, which otherwise you wouldn't be able to see. So, and then carving off the excess. And you can see afterwards that the surface curvature is much more uniform and aesthetically pleasing. At this point, we still had the open cavities from the screws, and those were, here you could see right through the panel. And we fabricated little dowels, which are not long grain dowels, but go cross grain so that they go in the same direction as the panel, and fit those in. But now at this point, remember the original crosspiece was dead flat, and it of course remained so. Here you can see the warp in the crosspiece track, and that the crosspiece itself would never fit in there. So we're faced with a dilemma. What are we going to do with this thing? Shall we hang it in a storage rack forever, because the panel is never going to go flat, and or is there some way that we could modify it and still retain it? And we decided in this case to do that. So what Jose is holding there is just a simple piece of plywood that we used by just putting the plywood in the track will give us a regular curvature, and we need a regular curvature if a crosspiece is going to be able to slide in a curved position. So we just use that as a temporary curve, and then we decided to cut the crosspiece twice, twice on a bandsaw in two different positions at the edges of the crosspiece track and at the edge of a bevel, so that and then you see the white piece added in the middle is the thickness of the saw blade, which we had to add back on the part that would go in the crosspiece track, so that it didn't change the angle of incidence, and then and it wouldn't also make the thing lower, so that when we put the cap on, it would otherwise be too much friction at the edge of the crosspiece track over here. So here we are, clamping the thing together, and then temporarily drilling two holes where we could put in screws just while it was curing, so that the pieces didn't slip out of alignment while we were working. And then we spread another araldite, another Ciba-Geigy araldite 2011, which has quite a long curing time and is one of the most stable resins I know. And we spread that on the various surfaces, clamped it in position temporarily just until drying. And after it came out, here's the crosspiece. After it comes out, here's one of the cuts along here, and the other is exactly underneath here, so that you can barely tell, even on the ends of it, you can barely tell where it happened. Here it is curved on its own. But you can still see that the crosspiece track is still fairly irregular, and we did have to make some modifications to regularize it to a certain extent in some areas, and we also adjusted little bits of the edges of the crosspiece itself. And then finally we ironed in a little bit of paraffin, scraped that off, buffed that surface, and then we're ready to insert it on its own. And here it is finished. So this way we felt it could have some better use than keeping it in storage. And here it is finished. Now the atom, I'm trying to move through this quickly because it's quite a lot of material, but the atom instead was composed of 4 boards, and also quite a poor quality of material. You can see what tangential cuts were here on the end grain. And one curious thing, though, you'll notice that this joint is skewed to one side, it's around 20 centimeters to this edge, and at the top it's instead around 27.5 centimeters. So that's quite a skewed joint there. And I just wanted to mention that that's something fairly common, especially in German painting. I've noticed it on many other Cranachs, and also on Leonardo's St. Jerome. It's on there as well. And I think that this is an efficiency tactic, so that planks, as they're cut out of a tree, some of them will end up being narrower on one end than another, and if you just square up one side of it and leave the other side have whatever angle that it normally comes out to be, and then you instead split the panel and then flip it, and then you can rotate it, and then it will be exactly the complementary angle necessary to turn the board back into a parallel surfaces. So I think it was a way of using material efficiently. So, but anyhow, it's just a curiosity. This is the last photograph known, the most recent photograph of the reverse of the Durer before cradling. And this was taken in 1960. By examining all the other photographs available, there's very little documentary evidence, but this group of photographs on the right, which were taken between 1971 and 74, first of all, the length of time seems to indicate to us that this may be the moment of cradling, 1971. And here you can see that not only is the entire surface faced, which would indicate some more complicated structural work going on, but you can see in two spots there where it seems like the cradle members are sticking out that edge, and we can see that they've already replaced a broken area there, which corresponded to that the crosspiece track, similar to what we saw in the eave. So we think that the cradling actually happened in 1971. So from 1971, when up until that point it had about the same number of splits as the eave, but since that cradle was applied, the panel now had more than 60 new splits generated. And here you have some raking light photos of the extremities. We faced just a very few areas that were the most precarious, the ones that seemed most recent and most fragile at the paint surface, and then we turned it over to begin removing the cross pieces. Now, I'm sure most people proceed in a similar fashion, where we try to make one series of cuts that correspond exactly to the edge of one of the cross members, and then you carve out or split by hand the material on the outside using the cross piece for contrast, and then you can make another saw cut and lift out those blocks and take out the cross piece. So here we are beginning that treatment, and but after doing just that first bit, we felt it was just, there were too many open splits. It was too much movement, downward pressure, and we felt that this was going to be dangerous over the course of the entire thing. So we finally decided to go to a circular saw with a carbide tip, a very narrow carbide tip blade, that it was very little resistance, and we felt that this would be much safer for it. So here is cut being made, lifting off those blocks, taking out the cross piece, and making another cut almost adjacent. So we made a series of cuts about a centimeter apart, but we left, as you can see here, we could, because the cradle is made of machined members, we could trust the thickness very well, and we were sure to leave ourselves a few millimeters from the bottom of it. And we also left around each cross piece a sort of U-shaped cleat, so that we could leave them in place to hold the panel stable while we removed most of the material. So here we are removing that, and you can see this method gives you the possibility of just inserting a metal blade, a scraper in this place, and snapping off those blocks with very, very little pressure, because on the end grain they hardly have any strength at all, and then remove the residue with hand tools, gouges, or planes. And we are continuing to take off those pieces. As we moved along, we used clamping pressure to hold everything in place so that the panel didn't start to warp before it was freed up in the lower areas. And then finally, the last ones were taken off by sawing by hand here. And some of these were glued to the surface because of seepage from the attachment of the cradle, and in those cases we had to pry up some areas and then remove residue like this. And then with little finger planes for violin making planes, Ibex planes with slightly curved bottom, we could easily clean up the residue, and then used scrapers to clear up the glue residue, and but without taking off very much at all, because we wanted to leave the cell structure clogged with whatever accumulated material it had without changing that. Now you can see after removal, in a 10-centimeter strip, we have about 8 or 9 splits already present there. So the panel with its 60-some-odd splits was incredibly fragile, even to move it in any way or turn it over. So we had to make a foam core cradle for it that you can see is built up into a curve, so that then we could clamp it onto the surface curved, and then we used just a masking tape to temporarily hold the sides together because it was so long it would flex. And we put that on both sides, and that held it stably so that we could turn it over. At that point, Alan and I left and went back to the States for nearly a week, and then in the interim, Rocio Davila cleaned the gesso and overpaint out of the existing cracks. But remember, there had been no treatment from 1971 until the present, so the only areas that were needing to be cleaned were those that had that had cracks that preceded the cradling. So everything else was pretty much open, and in this area you could see there was quite a level difference after removing the fillings, that this area corresponding to the crosspiece track was completely crushed. And we decided, for a number of reasons, it doesn't have an original surface anymore. The cracks went all the way down to the surface. Many of them were very tight, that we couldn't introduce an adhesive that we could guarantee would go all the way to the bottom. So we opted for this method, and I just want to show you the bits that had been developed first by the Opificio delle Pietre Dure, Ciro Castelli, together with a firm in Milan that was able to make these bits that are 14 degrees wide, so that it's an incredibly difficult thing to have something as fine as this be able to cut accurately without burning. So it's really a remarkable thing. And so this one is about 24 degrees, and this one is about 14. And so this is what we used. You could see that it gives you the opportunity to cut very accurately down very close to the surface and make a perfect gluing face on both sides, a perfect fit. And at a depth of about 12 millimeters, we're only open 2 millimeters wide on the surface. So this is us making the positive inserts that we could change very, very slightly until we got a perfect fit there. And the wood we used came from an 18th century stretcher that was taken off of Rubens, which happened to be in the studio, and it was nearly identical material. So it's a tedious process doing the putting these in, because you go down a couple of millimeters into a split that's straight, make sure that you're on the split as you go down, and have to do 2 or 3 passes, always making sure that you're on the split as you go down. If a split deviates slightly from being perpendicular, it makes it more difficult, because after you go down 2 millimeters, you have to move it over slightly and then go down a little deeper, and hopefully by the time you get to the bottom, you're able to encompass the previous starts. But that is not possible when you have a split that deviates much farther from perpendicular. That the various attempts, you'll never recover where the split started with such a narrow opening. So in some cases, you would either use a wider a wider bit, or you could build up the guides that hold the router and have a much longer extended bit to be able to go in at the proper angle. But in this case, we did not do that. But this gives you an opportunity, as I say, these segments remain pretty much the exact configuration that they are, and all we're wanting to do is change the configuration of them. So it's not that we're putting undue pressure on the panel to get it to conform to a position that we want it to be in. We used micrometers accurate to 1/10 of a millimeter to judge the panel's thickness over every section of the panel, and you can see that this particular one has a throat of 50 centimeters, which was adequate for this panel because it was only 80 centimeters wide. We could get it from one side or another. However, in cases that are wider, I don't know if everyone knows about the Hacklinger thickness gauge, also used for for musical instruments makers, and this is also accurate to 1/10 of a millimeter. You can see up here that this is between 5 and 6 millimeters, these gradations. The thinner the panel is, the more accurate the measurement becomes, and it works by taking this magnet and taking it off and putting it underneath the panel, and then you can drag it around the surface wherever you like and measure the surface incredibly accurately. And we would compare those two things to be sure we were accurate, and also use depth measurements to make sure that our router setting was cutting exactly what it told us it was. So then we proceeded, and I want to just run through this very quickly. Okay, I'm getting the hook? Okay. Okay, so here we are just running through many of these. There's just an enormous number of them. There were more than 200 changes of direction with the router that had to be set. Here you see us. We did use Mylar to transfer, cracks that were not perpendicular, to transfer them to the reverse. We used Mylar tracings, and you can see, let's say, in other areas where we removed fillings and there was big step on the surface, and we would have to cut those open. Here you can see us extracting a nail from inside, and then cutting in from the reverse and clamping, and then bringing it back into surface alignment. This area was totally crushed into the surface, and you can see the level difference here below surface, and we wanted to get that out, so we removed as much filling as we could every place to free it up to be able to push it up. We faced that area. As much as we tried, we couldn't budge the thing. It was also torqued considerably, so we finally decided to hold it in place with some araldite, carve away down to about 1 millimeter thickness. You can see this is the ground here at the bottom of the woodworm tunnels, and then we temporarily glued in with araldite some fixed points of contact that we could use small wedges to push up to the surface. And then after holding it in place with a little bit of araldite, we could rebuild that area with several pieces, plane them off, and bring that back up to surface level. Okay, this is the final large split, which we wanted to open completely because it gave more flexibility. And here you can see, after completing most of those cracks, by now we're so fed up with it, Alan has fallen asleep on his feet. And Jose is practicing his lounge singer act. So this is the various areas of the splits. We ended up, Alan counted 388 wedges that we put in there, and at this point we had to make a secondary support. So we cut 5 millimeter thick strips, which we stacked in columns of 4 along where these cross members are. We laminated them together and put them on the panel for drying. Now, this might look like a medieval torture device, but in fact, if you really look closely at it, these blocks build up to about 1 millimeter above the surface, so that as we slowly increase the pressure on those things, it just goes down and barely touches the surface of the panel. So it's almost not touching it at all, and that becomes clear when you see the clamps after gluing, and you remove the clamps. There's no spring back at all, and so they just sit there under their own curvature. These are the spring mechanisms about which I'll be talking in the second talk, so I won't mention much about them, only show you that we played around with the arrangement of them, and then this is cutting the various slots necessary for application. In this case, we added another routed slot 5 millimeters deep because we increased the thickness of the strainer from what we had originally planned. The mechanism works best at 15 millimeters from the surface of the panel, so we set it in by 5 millimeters, and this is something, of course, that could always be done. Here we are putting the strainer together, routing the outside, and then marking the areas that would have a contact button adhered onto the surface. And here's the strainer about to be applied, and you can see at the bottom edge we've made a little shelf that holds the panel vertically so that it doesn't fatigue the springs over time. And here we are putting in the mechanism, sliding it into its slot, putting it together, and here it is after treatment. And you can see here how easily it moves away from the surface, and there's the curvature finally at the end, and the improvement in the surface from previous. And the curvature, the overall curvature, was almost identical in the two panels after treatment. There you go. I'm sorry for having taken
Well, thanks very much, George, for the most extraordinary and riveting talk. And I think I would have been lynched if I'd actually asked George to say at a time.